I remember the exact shade of gray that afternoon. Not the harsh metallic gray of winter storms, but something softer, more forgiving. The kind of light that makes everything look like it's been dipped in watercolor and left to dry. It filtered through the tall windows of my classroom, casting long rectangles across the linoleum floor where dust motes drifted like tiny planets in their own quiet orbit. The school had emptied an hour ago. I could hear the distant hum of the janitor's vacuum somewhere down the hall, but otherwise the building held that particular silence that only comes when children have gone home and left their energy echoing in empty spaces. I stood at the whiteboard, eraser in hand, watching the last traces of today's lesson disappear into pale smudges. Shakespeare's sonnets. Love poetry. The irony wasn't lost on me. That's when I saw it. A single daisy sat on my desk like an accusation. Its white petals were slightly wilted at the edges, the stem damp and wrapped carefully in a piece of notebook paper torn from a spiral-bound pad. The kind of paper my students used. The kind Emery used when he substituted here, back when he still came around. My hand stopped moving across the board. The eraser hung suspended in the air as I stared at that flower, trying to make sense of its presence. For 3 weeks, I had convinced myself that what happened between us meant nothing, that his laugh had been answer enough, that the way he left that evening, quick and awkward, had been the period at the end of a sentence I should never have started. I set the eraser down on the metal ledge beneath the whiteboard and walked to my desk. The daisy looked impossibly small against the stack of ungraded essays, the coffee-stained grade book, the collection of red pens that never seemed to last long enough. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I found myself remembering his hands, how they moved when he talked, the way his fingers drummed against his thigh when he was thinking. 3 weeks earlier, in this same room, I had said the words that had been building inside me for months. I like you. Simple, honest, terrifying. The late afternoon sun had been streaming through these same windows, turning everything golden, and I had finally found the courage to speak a truth that had been living quietly in my chest since the day he first borrowed my copy of Neruda and actually returned it with thoughtful notes in the margins. He had laughed, not cruelly, but with surprise, maybe even panic. The sound had cut through the warm air between us like something sharp and unexpected. Then he had gathered his things, mumbled something about being late, and left me standing in that golden light feeling like I had just thrown something precious off a cliff. I told myself it was better this way. Cleaner. I returned to my routines, my solitary evenings with tea and old records, my careful distance from anything that might require me to be vulnerable again. I convinced myself that what I had felt was just loneliness dressed up as affection, that his kindness had been simple collegiality, nothing more. But here was this flower, impossible to ignore. I finally reached for it, my fingers closing around the damp stem. The notebook paper crinkled softly, and I wondered if there were words written inside, if he had tried to explain himself the way I had written and rewritten explanations in letters I never sent. The daisy trembled slightly in my hand, and I realized I was shaking. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and sending the last autumn leaves skittering across the empty parking lot. The gray light was fading toward evening, and soon the streetlights would flicker on, casting their amber glow over the small coastal town where everyone knew everyone and secrets had a way of becoming common knowledge whether you wanted them to or not. I stood there in my darkening classroom, holding that wilted daisy, unsure whether to see it as an apology or a question, as hope or as another kind of heartbreak entirely. All I knew was that Emery had been here, in this space where I spent my days teaching other people's children about love and iambic pentameter, and he had left something behind. Something that suggested, perhaps, that these 3 weeks of silence had meant something to him too. I suppose I should explain who I was before the daisy, before Emery, before everything shifted like sand beneath my feet. I was Julian Marsh, 34 years old, living a life so carefully constructed that it barely made a sound. I taught English at Coastal Harbor High School, the same school I had attended 20 years earlier, in a town where nothing much changed except the names on the mailboxes and the color of paint on the Victorian houses that lined Elm Street. My cottage sat at the end of a gravel lane, tucked between two larger homes whose owners I knew only well enough to wave to when collecting mail. It had belonged to my Aunt Catherine, who left it to me when she died 5 years ago, along with her collection of vinyl records and a lifetime's worth of tea tins arranged alphabetically in the kitchen cupboard. I kept both exactly as she had left them. Every morning, I would wake to silence, put on one of her records while the kettle heated on the stove. Miles Davis or Billie Holiday, sometimes Chopin if the weather was particularly gray. I would stand by the kitchen window, watching the harbor through the bare branches of the oak tree in my yard, steam rising from my cup like small prayers I never quite knew how to voice. I was the kind of person people described as nice, reliable. The teacher parents requested for their children because I was patient and fair, never raised my voice, never caused trouble. I had been there long enough to become part of the landscape, as predictable as the lighthouse that swept its beam across the water every evening at dusk. But there were things about me that no one knew. In my 20s, I had written poetry. Real poetry, the kind that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. I believed then in the possibility of quiet, faithful companionship, the kind of love that unfolded slowly like morning glory vines reaching toward light. I imagined a life shared with someone who would understand why I kept books stacked beside my bed, why I saved ticket stubs from movies that moved me, why I sometimes stood in my garden at midnight just to listen to the sound of wind moving through leaves. Years passed. Nothing ever quite happened. The poems got filed away in a shoebox under my bed. I learned to fill the silence with lesson planning and solitary dinners, with books borrowed from the library, and long walks along the shore when the tourists weren't around to crowd the narrow beaches. At school, I existed in a comfortable kind of isolation. Principal Andrews respected my work, but rarely asked about my personal life. My colleagues, mostly married with children, included me in their conversations about weekend plans and vacation stories, but there was always a politeness to it, a careful distance that suited everyone just fine. Even Clara, the art teacher who sometimes joined me for lunch, seemed content to talk about her students' projects and the weather without venturing into anything more personal. I told myself this was enough. That contentment was a reasonable substitute for the kind of love I had once imagined. That teaching Shakespeare's sonnets to 17-year-olds who would rather be anywhere else was its own form of poetry, even if it wasn't the kind I had once written for myself. Then Emery arrived. He came in October, hired as a temporary substitute when Mrs. Patterson went on medical leave. The first day I saw him, he was standing in the main office looking slightly overwhelmed, his dark hair disheveled from the wind, a messenger bag slung across his shoulder, like he was prepared for an adventure rather than a semester of teaching 8th grade history to kids who thought the Civil War happened sometime around when their grandparents were born. He was everything I was not. Boisterous where I was reserved, charming where I was careful, a little chaotic in the way that made the secretaries smile and the students pay attention. He had opinions about everything and wasn't afraid to share them during faculty meetings. He borrowed sugar for his coffee and always forgot to return it. He stayed late not because he was meticulous like me, but because he got caught up in conversations with students who lingered after class to argue about homework assignments or ask advice about problems that had nothing to do with American history. And somehow, impossibly, he noticed me. It started small. He borrowed my copy of Neruda when he overheard me mention it to Clara. He returned it a week later with careful notes written in the margins, questions about translation and rhythm that showed he had actually read it, actually thought about it. He asked if I had recommendations for other poets, said he had never paid much attention to poetry, but found himself curious about it now. Then came the late conversations. Emery would appear in my classroom after the building had emptied, ostensibly to grade papers, but really, I think, because he was lonely in the way that comes with being new somewhere. We would talk about teaching, about the particular challenges of reaching kids who had convinced themselves they didn't care about learning. But the conversations always wandered into other territory. He told me about growing up in Chicago, about his mother's garden, about getting lost in Rome during a college trip and finding it was the best part of the whole experience. I found myself staying later than usual, timing my departure with his. I began looking forward to those moments when our paths would cross in the hallway, when he would stop by my classroom to ask about book recommendations or share some amusing story about his students' latest creative interpretations of historical events. For the first time in years, I began to feel something stir, something I had almost forgotten was possible. For months, those late conversations became the rhythm of my days. I would plan my lessons around the possibility that Emery might stop by afterward, might linger in the doorway with some question about curriculum or some story that couldn't wait until tomorrow. I began to recognize the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the particular way he knocked on my classroom door. 2 quick taps followed by a pause. I wrote letters I never sent, pages and pages of careful words, trying to capture what was happening between us without naming it directly. I would draft them late at night by lamplight, then fold them into small squares and slip them between the pages of books I knew I would never lend to anyone. Love letters to someone who might not even realize he was being loved. The confession came on a Thursday in late November. I remember because the heating system had been acting up all week, and my classroom felt unusually warm despite the November chill outside. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows in thick golden bars, and Emery had been helping me rearrange desks after a particularly enthusiastic group discussion about Hamlet had left the room in cheerful disarray. He was telling me about Rome again, how he had wandered away from his study abroad group and found himself in a neighborhood where no one spoke English and all the street signs seemed to point in directions that made no sense. He described sitting on a fountain's edge, completely lost, watching old men play chess in a piazza while children chased pigeons between their feet. He said it was the first time in his life he had felt completely present, completely awake to where he was and who he was in that moment. The way he talked about it, with such unguarded pleasure, made something inside my chest loosen and tighten all at once. He was perched on the edge of a student desk, his jacket thrown over the back of a chair, his sleeves rolled up despite the November cold. The light caught the side of his face as he gestured, and I realized I had been memorizing him without meaning to. The curve of his mouth when he smiled, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he leaned forward, the small scar near his left temple that I had never asked about but wondered about constantly. I like you. The words came out so quietly I wasn't sure I had actually spoken them aloud. But Emery stopped mid-sentence, his hands frozen in the gesture he had been making, and I knew he had heard. The silence that followed felt enormous, like all the air had been pulled out of the room. It wasn't a declaration. I hadn't meant it to be. It was simply the truth, spoken without ceremony or expectation, the way you might mention that it was getting dark outside, or that the coffee in the faculty lounge was particularly bitter that day. Just something that was real and present and impossible to keep inside any longer. Emery laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of surprise that comes when someone tells you something you weren't prepared to hear. His eyes went wide for a moment. Then he looked down at his hands, then back at me with an expression I couldn't read. I don't know what to do with that, he said finally. His voice was gentle but distant, like he was already pulling away even though he hadn't moved from the desk. I nodded, feeling heat rise in my face. I told him it was okay, that I hadn't expected anything, that I just thought he should know. But he was already gathering his things, his movements quick and awkward in a way that was so unlike his usual easy confidence that it made everything worse. He left without looking back, and I stood in that golden light feeling like I had just stepped off a cliff and was still falling. For 3 weeks, I convinced myself it didn't matter. I returned to my solitary routines with the dedication of someone trying to forget they had ever wanted anything different. I rewrote lesson plans that didn't need rewriting. I graded papers with excessive thoroughness. I took longer walks along the shore, letting the wind and the sound of waves wash away the memory of his laugh, the look in his eyes before he turned away. Emery stopped coming by my classroom. When we passed each other in the hallways, he would nod politely but keep walking. During faculty meetings, he sat on the opposite side of the room and avoided eye contact. I told myself this was for the best, that whatever I had felt was just loneliness dressed up as something more significant. Then, 3 weeks later, he came back. I found him in my classroom after school, not sitting at a student desk as he used to, but standing by the windows looking out at the parking lot. He had left the daisy on my desk, wrapped in that piece of notebook paper, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking anywhere but at me. The conversation that followed was careful, full of pauses and half-finished sentences. He didn't apologize. He didn't mention what had happened 3 weeks ago or acknowledge the flower he had left. Instead, he asked if I needed help cleaning the whiteboards. He offered to straighten the books on my shelves. He talked about his mother's garden, how she had taught him that flowers were a language you could speak without words, how daisies meant new beginnings. I didn't ask what had changed. I didn't ask why he had come back or what the flower was supposed to mean. I was afraid that asking might make him disappear again, and I wasn't sure I could survive another 3 weeks of his absence. Instead, I handed him a cloth and pointed him toward the boards, and we worked in companionable silence as the light outside faded from gold to gray to the soft purple of early evening. When we finished, he gathered his things more slowly than he had that day 3 weeks ago. At the door, he paused and looked back at me with something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that looked almost like hope, though I didn't dare trust myself to name it. The change came gradually, like morning light creeping across the harbor. Emery began appearing in places where our paths might naturally cross. In the teacher's lounge, brewing coffee with the same careful attention he once gave to grading papers. Walking the same route to the parking lot, his pace slower than before, as if he was no longer in a hurry to leave. Standing by my classroom door at the end of the day, not quite entering, but not quite walking away either. There was a gentleness to him now that hadn't been there before, a steadiness that felt like someone trying to earn back something they had accidentally broken. When he spoke to me, his voice was softer, more measured, as if he was learning a new language and wanted to make sure he pronounced each word correctly. We began meeting after school again, though this time we called it lesson planning. Emery would appear with a stack of papers and a thermos of coffee, spreading materials across the student desks like he had legitimate pedagogical business to discuss. And perhaps he did. But the conversations always wandered away from curriculum and into the territory we had inhabited before, that space between us where words carried more weight than their dictionary definitions. I was cautious. I still remembered the sound of his laugh, the way he had gathered his things and left without looking back. But this Emery was different. Slower, more thoughtful. He listened with the kind of attention that made you feel like your words mattered, like they were being carefully considered rather than simply heard. One evening, as we sat across from each other at adjoining desks, he told me about his past in a way he never had before. He said he had spent most of his 20s being afraid of being seen, really seen, for who he was underneath the charm and the easy conversation. He talked about a man he had known in Chicago, someone he cared about who had needed more than Emery felt ready to give. I said no to him, Emery said, staring down at the papers spread between us. Not because I didn't care, but because I was terrified of caring too much. I convinced myself it was better to be safe than sorry, better to keep things simple than risk everything for something I wasn't sure I understood. He looked up at me then, and I saw something raw in his expression, something that looked like regret mixed with recognition. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, he said, about how many times we say no to things that might change us, just because change feels dangerous. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. But I understood what he was telling me, what he was trying to explain without explaining. That his laugh 3 weeks ago hadn't been about me. It had been about his own fear, his own habit of stepping back from anything that felt too real, too consequential. A few days later, I found a book on my desk. Not borrowed this time, but given. It was a collection of contemporary poetry, slim and well-worn, with a small piece of paper marking a page near the middle. The note was written in Emery's careful handwriting. Page 42 reminds me of you. I waited until I was home to read it. The poem was about standing beside someone you wish you had the courage to love, about the space between wanting and having, about how sometimes the most profound connections happen in the silence between words. I read it 3 times before I understood that this was Emery's way of apologizing, of explaining, of offering something he couldn't quite say aloud. Fridays became our ritual. We would walk together to harbor grounds, the coffee shop near the wharf that served pastries too sweet and coffee too strong, but stayed open late enough for teachers who needed somewhere to go that wasn't home or school. Emery always paid, waving away my protests with a smile that said this was important to him, this small gesture of care. I always chose the table by the window, where I could watch the harbor lights reflect on the water while we talked. The conversations in that coffee shop were different from our classroom meetings. More personal, less guarded. Emery told me about his childhood, about growing up with a mother who taught him that love was something you showed through small, consistent acts rather than grand gestures. I told him about my aunt, about the cottage filled with her records and tea tins, about how I had learned to be alone without being lonely, though I wasn't sure that was entirely true anymore. We talked about books and music, about the particular melancholy of coastal towns in winter, about our students and their stubborn brilliance. We talked about everything except what was happening between us, this slow, careful dance we were performing around something neither of us was quite ready to name. But there were moments, small ones, brief touches that felt electric and intentional. Once, when I was reaching for my coffee cup, Emery's fingers brushed against my wrist. Just for a second, just long enough for me to feel the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor in his hand that suggested he was as affected by the contact as I was. He didn't pull away immediately, and I didn't either. We sat there for a moment, connected by that small point of contact, both of us staring at our joined hands like we were witnessing something miraculous and fragile. Then he moved his hand away, and we continued our conversation about lesson plans and weather as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I could feel it in the way my pulse quickened, in the way the air between us seemed charged with possibility. I began to hope again, despite myself. Despite the memory of his laugh, despite 3 weeks of silence, despite every reasonable voice in my head that warned me against reading too much into coffee dates and borrowed books, and the brush of fingers against skin. I hoped because Emery was showing me, in small and careful ways, that whatever had frightened him before was something he was trying to overcome. But hope felt dangerous. Hope felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and considering whether the view was worth the fall. I had built a life around not needing more than what I had, around being content with solitude and routine and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. Hoping for more felt like betraying everything I had convinced myself was enough. Still, I found myself planning my days around the possibility of seeing him. I chose my clothes more carefully, wore the blue sweater he had once complimented. I brought extra tea to school in case he wanted some. I stayed later than necessary, grading papers that didn't need to be graded, just in case he might stop by. And he did stop by, more and more often, always with some excuse, some legitimate reason for being there. But we both knew the real reason, even if we weren't ready to say it aloud. We both knew that something was building between us, something that felt both inevitable and impossible, like watching a storm approach across the water and knowing you were about to be changed by it. It happened on a Friday evening in December, when the early winter darkness had settled over the harbor like a blanket and the wind carried the salt smell of snow that wouldn't come for weeks yet. We had been walking after coffee, taking the long way back to our cars, when Emery suggested we sit for a moment on the bench that overlooked the cliffs. The bench was old weathered wood, placed there by the town decades ago for tourists who wanted to watch the sunset over the water. But tourists didn't come in December, and we had the entire overlook to ourselves. The sea stretched out below us, dark and restless, white foam catching what little light remained in the sky. Emery had been quiet all evening. Not the comfortable quiet we had grown used to, but something heavier, more deliberate. He sat with his hands clasped between his knees, staring out at the water like he was trying to find words written in the movement of the waves. The wind pulled at our jackets, and I could feel the cold seeping through the wooden slats of the bench. I should have suggested we go back to our cars, back to the warmth and light of the parking lot. But something in Emery's posture told me this moment mattered, that whatever he was working towards saying needed this particular setting, this particular silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I almost missed it under the sound of wind and water. "I thought I was straight for a long time," he said, still staring out at the sea. I think I laughed because I was terrified. I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. The words hung in the air between us like something fragile that might shatter if I moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. I kept my eyes on the water, on the rhythm of waves against the rocks below, giving him space to continue or retreat as he needed. "But I haven't stopped thinking about you," he said, and now his voice was stronger, more certain. "Not for a day. Not for a single day since that afternoon in your classroom." I turned to look at him then, and found him already looking at me. His face was pale in the dim light, his dark hair messy from the wind, but his eyes were steady and serious in a way I had never seen before. There was no laughter now, no nervous energy, just truth, offered like a gift he wasn't sure I would want to receive. It wasn't a kiss. Not yet. It was something quieter and more profound than that. It was a shared breath, a moment when time seemed to slow and settle around us like snow. We sat there looking at each other while the wind pulled at our clothes and the sea crashed against the rocks below, and I felt something inside my chest open like a door I had been afraid to walk through. I could see everything in his face. The fear that had made him laugh 3 weeks ago. The loneliness that had driven him to those late conversations in my classroom. The hope that was fragile and new and asking for permission to grow into something larger. And underneath it all, something that looked like recognition, like he was seeing me for the first time and realizing he had been looking for me without knowing it. We didn't say anything else. There was nothing that needed saying. We sat there until the cold became too much to ignore, until the lighthouse beam began its evening sweep across the water, and then we walked back to our cars in a silence that felt full rather than empty. At home, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled the shoebox out from under my bed, the one filled with poems I had written in my 20s, and convinced myself to forget. I spread them across my kitchen table like artifacts from a life I had once imagined living, and I read them by candlelight while my tea grew cold. They were love poems, all of them. Poems about waiting and wanting and the particular ache of hoping for something you're not sure exists. Poems about quiet mornings and shared silences and the way love can feel like coming home to a place you've never been. Reading them now, after months of careful conversations and brushed fingers and the weight of Emery's eyes on mine, I realized I had been writing about him before I knew him. Writing about the possibility of him, the shape he would make in my life when he finally arrived. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by old poems and the ghosts of younger selves, watching the candle burn down to nothing while I tried to understand what was happening to me. What had happened to us, there on that bench by the water, when Emery had finally found the courage to tell me the truth about who he was and what he wanted. The next morning, I found lavender on my desk. A small sprig, purple and fragrant, wrapped in the same kind of notebook paper as the daisy had been. This time there was writing on the paper, just a few words in Emery's careful handwriting, for courage. I held the lavender to my nose and breathed in its clean, honest scent. Lavender for courage, daisies for new beginnings. I was learning his language, the way he spoke in flowers when words felt too dangerous or insufficient. And I was beginning to understand that this was his way of asking me to be brave with him, to take the step we had both been circling around for months. That afternoon, when he appeared in my classroom doorway, I didn't wait for him to find an excuse for being there. I simply looked up from my papers and smiled, and he smiled back, and we both knew that something fundamental had shifted between us. Something that couldn't be taken back or explained away or reduced to the simple friendship we had been pretending was enough. The whispers started small, the way they always do in places where everyone knows everyone and privacy is a luxury few can afford. A student mentioned seeing Mr. Marsh and Mr. Coleman walking together after school. The secretary noticed they seemed to take their coffee breaks at the same time. Mrs. Henderson from the math department wondered aloud why the English teacher and the substitute were spending so much time together when they taught completely different subjects. At first, the comments were harmless enough, wrapped in the casual curiosity that passes for conversation in faculty lounges. But I could feel the weight of attention shifting toward us, the way conversations paused when we entered a room together, resumed with slightly different energy when we left. In a school where routine was religion and deviation was noticed, Emery and I had become something worth noticing. I should have been more careful. We both should have been. But after that evening by the water, after Lavender and Courage and the quiet truth we had finally spoken aloud, being careful felt like betraying something sacred. So we continued our Friday coffee dates, our after-school conversations, our careful dance around feelings that were no longer quite so carefully hidden. The note appeared on a Tuesday morning, slipped between the pages of my grade book while I was teaching second period. A folded piece of paper with careful teenage handwriting. Mr. Marsh, Ashley thinks you and Mr. Coleman are dating. Are you? We won't tell anyone. We just want to know. I stared at those words until they blurred, my heart hammering against my ribs. 16-year-old Ashley Martinez, bright and observant, and absolutely incapable of keeping a secret. If she had noticed, if she was talking about it with classmates, then our careful discretion had failed more completely than I had realized. I folded the note and slipped it into my desk drawer, then continued teaching Macbeth as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The air in the classroom felt different, charged with the knowledge that we were being watched, discussed, analyzed by minds too young to understand the complexity of what they thought they were seeing. Principal Andrews called me to his office on a Thursday afternoon. He was a kind man, someone who had known me for nearly a decade, who trusted my judgment and respected my work. But he was also careful, conscious of the delicate balance required to run a school in a town where tradition carried more weight than tolerance. "Julian," he said, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from his desk, "I wanted to have a quick word with you about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries." The phrase hung between us like a gently worded threat. He didn't mention Emery by name. He didn't specify what boundaries might be in question. But we both understood what he was really saying, what concerns had been brought to his attention. I nodded, said very little, agreed that professionalism was important. But inside, something hardened into resolve. I had spent my entire adult life being appropriate, maintaining boundaries, keeping my personal truth carefully separated from my professional obligations. I had built a life around being invisible, unremarkable, safe. That same afternoon, Emery found me in my classroom looking like someone had delivered devastating news. His temporary position wouldn't be renewed for the spring semester, he told me. No specific reason given, just budget constraints and changing needs. We both knew it wasn't about money or scheduling. We both understood what was really happening. He sat heavily in one of the student desks, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something defeated and tired. "Maybe I shouldn't have come back," he said, staring at his hands. "Maybe I shouldn't have left that flower on your desk, shouldn't have pushed for something that was always going to be complicated." The words hit me like cold water, shocking in their finality. For months, I had been afraid of hoping too much, of wanting something that might be taken away. Now, faced with the reality of loss, I realized that fear had been the wrong response entirely. That evening, I drove to Emery's apartment. I had never been there before, had only the address from the school directory and a fierce determination that felt like courage and panic twisted together. The building was small and shabby, the kind of place substitute teachers could afford, with narrow hallways that smelled like cooking oil and old carpet. He answered the door in a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans, his hair messy like he had been running his hands through it. When he saw me standing in his doorway, his expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like relief mixed with resignation. We sat on his couch, surrounded by boxes he had already started packing. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we hadn't said, everything we were afraid to lose. "Maybe you should have come back sooner," I told him finally, the words coming out stronger than I felt. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Hope, maybe. Or recognition that we were both tired of being afraid, tired of choosing safety over truth. When we kissed, it wasn't desperate or hurried. It was tender, careful, full of aching sweetness and the weight of months of waiting. I trembled against him, my hands shaking as I touched his face, his neck, the solid reality of him. I had spent my entire life withholding, keeping parts of myself locked away where they couldn't be hurt or judged or taken away. But here, in his small apartment with boxes stacked around us like the remnants of a life being dismantled, I let myself be completely present, completely vulnerable. I stayed until late, talking and touching and marveling at how natural it felt to be close to him, how right it felt despite everything the world might say about rightness. When I finally drove home through the empty streets, I felt like I was carrying something precious and fragile, something worth protecting no matter what it cost. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a blank piece of paper, and I wrote my resignation letter. 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately after winter break. I cited personal reasons, thanked Principal Andrews for his support, offered to help train my replacement. Then I drove to school and left the letter on his desk before anyone else arrived. I didn't explain my decision to my colleagues. I didn't justify it or defend it or apologize for it. I simply chose uncertainty over invisibility, chose the possibility of love over the safety of silence. 6 months later, I work at Harbor Books, a small shop tucked between the fishmonger and the post office where tourists buy novels for beach reading and locals come looking for gardening guides and cookbooks. The owner, Mrs. Chun, hired me because I actually read the books I recommend, because I can talk to customers about Neruda and Shakespeare with equal enthusiasm, because I don't mind the quiet hours when the only sound is the harbor bell ringing across the water. It's a different kind of teaching, this work of matching people with stories they didn't know they needed. A different kind of satisfaction than standing before rows of desks, trying to convince 17-year-olds that poetry matters. Here, I sell books to people who already believe in the power of words, who come seeking something specific or allow themselves to be surprised by something unexpected. Emery teaches 3 days a week at the community center, working with adults who are learning to read, immigrants studying for citizenship tests, teenagers who dropped out of high school and decided to try again. He loves it in a way he never quite loved substitute teaching. Loves the particular challenge of reaching people who have chosen to be there, who want to learn despite everything that has convinced them learning isn't for them. We live in a small flat above Coastal Blooms, the flower shop on Harbor Street. Mrs. Rodriguez, who owns the shop, rented it to us for less than we expected because she said she liked the idea of teachers living above her store, liked knowing that people who cared about growing things in young minds would be living above someone who grew things with her hands. The flat is small but bright, with windows that face the water and a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people to move around each other while making dinner. We kept some of my aunt's records, the ones that sounded right in this new space. Miles Davis for Sunday mornings, Billie Holiday for evenings when the fog rolls in thick enough to muffle the sound of the harbor. I write again, not the careful, crafted poems of my 20s, but something more immediate, more alive. Short verses on napkins while we're having breakfast, fragments of thoughts captured on the backs of bookmarks and receipts. Nothing polished or precious, just the daily practice of paying attention to the way light moves across our kitchen table, the sound of Emery humming while he grades papers, the particular quality of silence that exists between 2 people who have chosen each other. He reads them while making coffee in the mornings, these small offerings I leave scattered around our shared space. Sometimes he responds with his own lines scribbled on the margin of the newspaper, observations about the way I fold laundry or the face I make when I'm concentrating on a particularly difficult crossword clue. There's a small glass vase on our windowsill, nothing fancy, just something Mrs. Rodriguez gave us when we moved in. Each week, Emery adds a new flower. Sometimes it's something from the shop downstairs, sometimes something he finds growing wild along the coastal paths. Roses for love, jasmine for grace, baby's breath for everlasting devotion. His own kind of poetry, spoken in the language he first taught me with that wilted daisy wrapped in notebook paper. This morning, I added my own contribution to the collection. The original daisy, pressed and faded now, carefully preserved between the pages of the Neruda collection he borrowed from me all those months ago. It looks fragile next to the fresh flowers, a ghost of itself, but it belongs there. It's where our story began, That moment of courage that led to all the other moments of courage that followed. There's a handwritten note taped to our refrigerator, something I wrote last week while Emery was at the community center and the late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the water outside our window. Just one line, simple and true. I waited. You returned. I loved. We don't talk about the school anymore, about the whispers and the carefully worded warnings and the price we paid for choosing honesty over safety. That life feels like something that happened to different people, younger versions of ourselves who didn't yet know that love could be worth the risk of losing everything else. Instead, we talk about small things. The customer who comes in every Tuesday looking for mysteries with cats in them. The student who learned to write his name in English after months of practice. The way the lighthouse beam sweeps across our ceiling at night, marking time in a rhythm older and more reliable than any clock. This is what I never imagined in my 20s, when I wrote poems about faithful companionship and quiet love. I thought it would be grander somehow, more dramatic. I didn't understand that love, real love, is mostly about the accumulation of ordinary moments, the choice to keep choosing each other through the dailiness of shared life. In the evenings, we walk along the harbor where tourists once pointed cameras at the sunset. We know all the shopkeepers now, the fishermen who leave before dawn, the lighthouse keeper who waves from his tower when he sees us passing below. We have become part of the rhythm of this place, no longer visitors or observers, but people with our own small story woven into the larger story of this town by the sea. Sometimes I think about that afternoon when I found the daisy on my desk, how I stood there shaking, unsure whether to see it as hope or heartbreak. Now I know it was both. It was the beginning of the most terrifying and necessary thing I have ever done, learning to love someone enough to risk being seen, really seen, for who I am underneath all the careful defenses I spent years building. I waited. You returned. I loved. The simplest story in the world, and the only one that matters.